Welcome, my friend, to another quiet journey through the past. Before we begin, take a slow breath in and let it out. Settle into your chair, your bed, or wherever you've chosen to listen. If your eyes are heavy, that's perfectly fine. You can let them close and simply let my voice carry you. But before we drift back to the restless seas of the 16th century, I have a small favor to ask. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. It is always fascinating to see how far this sleepy little crew of ours has spread across the world. And if you enjoy these gentle voyages into history, if you find comfort in falling asleep to the past whispered softly in your ear, please remember to like this video, share it, and subscribe. It helps our community grow, and it keeps these midnight journeys alive. Now, let's set sail, not on a grand adventure, not with the polished glamour of Hollywood pirates or the romance of buried treasure. Tonight, we'll step aboard a real pirate ship, the way it truly was, crowded, damp, and often miserable. We'll smell the tar and the sweat, taste the stale bread alive with weevils, and hear the endless creak of timber as the waves roll beneath us. This is what it was really like on a 16th century pirate ship, the horrible, uncomfortable, and strangely human life of rogues who dared to live beyond the law. So let the fire crackle softly in the background, let the sea wind fill your imagination, and let's begin. Let's begin with the hard truth, the one that every would-be pirate learns quickly. It may have sounded like freedom, adventure, and gold. A newly minted crew member, still adjusting to the noise, the sway, and the crushing routine. But you would have regretted becoming a pirate in 1565. The sails must be checked and trimmed, the decks scrubbed with sandstone and brine. You're handed a piece of hardtack, essentially a biscuit, though it's harder than bone and often alive with weevils. There's salted beef, but it's grayish and tough, because on a pirate ship, failure to obey orders or simply annoying the wrong officer could lead to brutal punishments. Keel hauling, for example, a term that sounds quaint today, but referred to the practice of tying a sailor and dragging him beneath the ship as hull. Endless hours, sometimes days, of nothing. Just a flap of canvas, the creak of timbers, and the groaning silence of the ocean. Boredom becomes a companion. Men dice, gamble, whittle, or fight. Stories are told and retold of gold, of glory, of freedom, but reality rarely matches the tales. You curse the wind and hope for a better port. Perhaps in the Caribbean or somewhere along the Spanish Main, you wonder if you'll ever see land again. Barnacles sliced skin like razors. But that treasure, when it comes, is often taken from ships far less prepared than yours merchants, mostly with little resistance. The violence is swift, impersonal. The loot, crates of cloth, barrels of sugar, sometimes coins, often not. Few survived it intact. So as scurvy your teeth may loosen, your gums may blacken. There is no doctor, only a surgeon, with a bone saw and a dirty cloth. Wounds fester. Fever spreads. Men are sometimes tossed overboard, still breathing. Every inch of space is spoken for. You sleep alongside your crewmates, sometimes above the cannon deck, where you'll be jolted awake at any hour if trouble appears on the horizon. Your hammock is damp. Your clothes are damp. Even your thoughts begin to feel ... waterlogged. If you're lucky, it hasn't turned entirely sour. And the water? It's stored in wooden barrels, and by now tastes faintly of mold and iron. Often it's safer to drink watered-down rum. Not for cleanliness, there's little hope for that, but to prevent the buildup of slime that might cause men to slip, and to deter the worst infestations of rats and lice. Let's linger a while longer in the waters of myth. Even if pirates rarely buried their plunder, the sea itself became a kind of vault, reluctant, ever-moving, and layered in silt. Ships went down in storms during skirmishes, or from simple misfortune. And when they sank, whatever they carried often stayed with them: coins, weapons, cargo, bones. Time made no effort to retrieve them. Over centuries, these wrecks hardened into legend. Locals would point to strange currents or whispers of light beneath the waves. Some said they saw golden glimmers just before dusk, or heard the creaking of a phantom ship in the fog. Others passed down stories from grandmother to grandchild of sailors who returned from the sea, not quite the same, or of maps that turned up in attic trunks, curling at the edges, ink faded but still visible. Historians today walk a fine line separating documented evidence from inherited stories, carefully picking apart the strands of truth from the seaweed-tangled threads of fantasy. But sometimes the distinction blurs. In the warm shallows off the coast of the Dominican Republic, for instance, divers have recovered coins stamped with the face of Charles II of Spain. These coins, known as pieces of 8, were real currency in the age of sail, widely accepted and heavily sought after. Some were clipped at the edges where sailors had snipped off bits of silver to barter or gamble. Others bore deep scratches, signs of teeth testing by those who wanted to ensure the metal was genuine. Each coin, though small, carries its own quiet story. And nearby, still partially buried under coral and sand, lie fragments of timber, iron nails, and ballast stones. No grand treasure, just echoes. Yet treasure hunting persists. Not the kind with parrots and pistols, but with sonar, remote submersibles, and permit applications. Modern salvers, like those working the treasure coast of Florida, still explore known wreck sites, places where Spanish galleons went down in the 1600s, often while hauling immense royal wealth back to Europe. Some divers speak of finding rosary beads pressed into the mud. Others uncover fragments of chainmail or ornate dagger hilts. There are whispers, too, of Jesuit rings and silver reliquaries locked in the grip of the sea. These aren't pirate treasures. They're remnants of empire, religion, and colonial ambition. Still, for those on the surface, those scanning the horizon or examining nautical charts by lamplight, the allure remains. The possibility that somewhere, perhaps just beyond the reef, something waits to be found. A box, a chest, a carved tablet with markings no one understands. And what of the maps? The maps. In the popular imagination, every pirate had one. A scrap of parchment singed at the corners, marked with skulls and symbols and riddles. But in truth, maps were rare and precious. Cartography was a profession of the learned of naval officers, monks, and scholars. Pirate captains might seize maps during raids, or steal them from merchant ships. Some hired skilled navigators to draw coastal outlines, to record the stars, to mark the shifting sands. Yet among the surviving papers from the era, there are few, if any, that match the romantic idea of a treasure map. No elaborate codes, no dotted trails to isolated islands, no X marks the spot. Still, in old maritime records there are strange notations, lines written in haste. directions to the cove of bones, or the spit where the coral cuts, or the rock that resembles a sleeping dog. These were practical markers used by smugglers and pirates alike to find familiar hiding places, or to recall where a skiff had once been hidden. Are they treasure maps? Not quite. But to those who know how to read them, they whisper of familiarity of places known only to those who had reason to remember. And once in a while, an artifact turns up that stirs the imagination further. A compass, rusted and delicate, recovered from a wreck site near Tortuga. A sailor's journal found in a waterlogged chest, with only a few entries, still legible mentions of the Green Lagoon, and a share owed to Jacobs, should he return, or a locket, its hinge sealed with sediment, believed to contain a miniature painting long since faded to gray. None of these objects declare themselves as treasure, but in their silence they speak. They speak of hands that once held them, of stories that were never written down, of plans made on the rocking deck of a ship under moonlight, plans that may have come to nothing, or perhaps to something long buried by time, tide, and memory. And in that way, perhaps the myth of pirate treasure lives on, not as gold, but as suggestion. A suggestion that the past is still out there waiting, breathing faintly under sand and salt, that in the lull between waves or in the hush before sleep, you might drift toward it, hearing faint footsteps on a distant shore, or the soft scrape of a spade against earth. The treasure may not be real, but the feeling it inspires, the ache for mystery, the longing for discovery, the gentle pull of the unknown, that is very real indeed. And now, with that thought softly lingering, let us turn our eyes once again to the sea, but this time not through the eyes of the desperate or the lawless, but through the polished lenses of the wealthy and protected. As we shift our gaze to the quiet opulence of the Spanish treasure fleet, where luxury moved with purpose across the same waters, carrying not just gold, but status, sanctity, and the illusion of control. If you were a pirate in the 16th century, your days were rough, uncertain, and often unpleasant. The sea was both home and prison, rocking you awake with salt spray, rattling you to sleep in a damp hammock, and never letting you forget the endless hunger that came with rations of hardtack and salted meat. But while you gnawed on biscuits crawling with weevils and counted the blisters on your hands, there was another world, a very different one, unfolding on the land you could not reach. It was the world of nobles. Let's take a slow step onto the polished floors of a nobleman's hall, leaving behind the creaking deck of your ship. The sounds change immediately. No longer the slap of waves or the shout of a mate. Instead, you hear the soft scrape of slippers on stone floors, the murmur of courtiers, the gentle pluck of a lute, or perhaps the delicate trickle of a fountain in a garden and only for leisure. Here, banquets stretched for hours. Long tables, heavy with roasted meats and fresh breads, glistened under candlelight. Silver plates reflected the flames, while goblets of wine were poured again and again, their deep color glowing like rubies. Nobles dined not on salted pork that had traveled months in a barrel, but on game birds freshly hunted from their estates, on fruits carried carefully from distant lands, on fish still slick from the river, while pirates wore patched linen shirts stiff with salt. Nobles wrapped themselves in silks that whispered with each movement. Their fabrics were dyed in colors most sailors never even dreamed of affording: deep crimsons, rich indigos, the kind of brilliant green that came from expensive dyes imported across the seas. Lace trimmed their collars, gold threaded their sleeves. Even their shoes, buckled and gleaming, set them apart from the bare, cracked feet of sailors. Money, coin, clinked freely here, where a pirate's share of plunder might be spent in a riotous week in a Caribbean tavern. A noble might order a golden goblet simply for the pleasure of drinking from it once. To a pirate, wealth was fleeting, often turned to rum and reckless wagers. To a noble, wealth was land inheritance and the power to command armies. Think of the contrast in shelter. A pirate slept under rough canvas, or in a wooden hull that leaped and groaned with every wave. A noble rested beneath carved wooden beams, in chambers hung with tapestries that told stories of heroes or saints. Feather mattresses supported them, and servants tended to their comfort, bringing water warmed with herbs or candles to light their evenings. But it was not only about comfort, it was also about certainty. Nobles knew more or less where tomorrow's meal would come from. Pirates did not. Nobles could trust their land and their laws. Pirates lived outside of both, always chaste, always uncertain when a sail on the horizon might spell the end of their brief career. Still, there was an odd symmetry. Nobles, with their titles, wielded power. Pirates, in their own way, did too. While a noble might command soldiers by the king's decree, a pirate captain commanded his crew by charisma and fear. A noble's court might echo with whispered intrigues. A pirate deck crackled with mutinous grumbles, and where nobles signed decrees with ink and seal, pirates carved their will into the world with cannon fire and cutlass steel. Yet, imagine being one of those nobles, sitting at the high table, hands resting on fine linen. Perhaps in a quieter moment, they wondered, just for a breath, what it might feel like to throw off duty and expectation, to abandon the heavy robes of ceremony, to leap aboard a ship and live by the wind and the wave. And perhaps on the sea, as you rocked in your hammock and dreamed of silk and roasted venison, you wondered if any noble would ever trade places with you. The truth is, they probably would not. And so the line held steady, nobles on land, wrapped in silks, surrounded by coin and power. Pirates at sea, sunburned, scarred, forever chasing fortune, and forever out of reach of the world of privilege. A life of rogues against a life of lords, divided not only by wealth and status, but by the endless, restless waters of the sea itself. Women on the waves, and Bonny and Mary Read. When you picture pirates, the image that often comes to mind is a crew of rough, unshaven men, scarred, sunburned, their hair tangled by salt and wind. And for the most part, that picture is true. Life at sea was thought to be no place for women. Ships were considered unlucky if they carried them, and many sailors whispered that the sea itself grew jealous when a woman stood upon its deck. But as with many rules, there were exceptions, and two of the most famous exceptions, two figures who became legends in their own right, were Bonny and Mary Read. Let us imagine them not as the fierce caricatures that appear in bold paintings, but as living women, breathing the same sea air as every sailor, moving carefully across the same slippery decks. Bonny was born into an unusual life from the start. Her father had raised her unconventionally, and she was said to have had a temper that matched her fiery hair. She married young, but her restless spirit carried her far from quiet domesticity. When she crossed paths with pirates in the Caribbean, particularly the notorious Calico, Jack Rackham, she stepped into a life that few women had dared to enter. Mary Reed's story was stranger still. Raised for a time as a boy, she learned early to disguise herself in men's clothing. She served as a soldier, she sailed as a man, and when she eventually found herself aboard a pirate ship, she revealed her secret only when it could no longer be kept. Yet rather than cast her aside, the crew came to respect her ferocity in battle. Both women defied not only the expectations of their gender, but also the law itself. When cannon smoke curled over the waves and cutlasses clashed, Bonny and Mary Reed stood among the fighters, voices sharp, blades ready. But let us slow the pace here. Imagine them not in the heat of battle, but in the quieter hours of ship life. Perhaps Bonny leaned on the rail at night, gazing at the silver line of the moon across the sea, her hair moving gently with the wind. Perhaps Mary Reed, dressed still in men's clothes for safety, rolled dice with the crew below deck, her laughter blending with theirs, her secret identity no longer the burden it had once been. On land, noble women were laced into corsets, their movements restricted by layers of fabric. They were told where they might go, whom they might marry, and how they should behave. On a pirate ship, Anne and Mary found something else entirely, a rough kind of freedom. Dangerous, short-lived, and violent, perhaps, but freedom all the same. Their lives did not end in grand triumph. Both were captured when Rackham's ship was overtaken, and their fates turned grim. Yet even in prison, Bonny is said to have spoken boldly, telling her lover Calico Jack that if he had fought like a man, he need not have died like a dog. Mary Reed's story closed not with fanfare, but with illness in captivity. Still, centuries later, their names endure, not as footnotes, not as curiosities, but as reminders that even within the harshest confines of history, some voices, even unexpected ones, break through the roar of the sea and the silence of the grave. As the ship creaks in your mind's ear and the waves roll steadily beneath it, imagine Anne and Mary standing there, side by side, two figures who refuse to bow to expectation. Women on the waves, part of a story bigger than themselves, yet entirely their own. Pirate havens, life in hidden harbors and island strongholds. For all their daring raids and open sea adventures, pirates could not live forever on the water. Ships needed repairs. Crews needed rest. Supplies had to be replenished. And so, scattered across the map, little dots of refuge grew into havens, places where pirates could lower their sails and breathe easy for a while. Picture a hidden cove in the Caribbean. The water is calm here, sheltered by curving cliffs. Palm trees lean toward the shore, their fronds stirring gently in the breeze. The sand is warm, soft beneath bare feet hardened by weeks of standing on wet wooden planks. Here, in places like Nassau in the Bahamas, Port Royal in Jamaica, or Tortuga off the coast of Haiti, pirates found something like a home. Nassau especially became almost mythical in its reputation. For a time in the early 18th century, it was the so-called Pirate Republic, a place where no king's law was recognized, where the only rule was the agreement of the crews who anchored there. Imagine dozens of ships bobbing gently in the harbor, their flags stitched from rough cloth, patched and repatched, fluttering in the wind. On the shore, taverns spilled music and laughter into the humid night. Here the air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and strong rum. Men who had faced starvation at sea could sit at rough tables and eat until they were full. Dice rolled across wooden boards, coins clinked, and the occasional scuffle broke out before dissolving into drunken camaraderie. For a short while, they could forget the dangers of storms, the hunger of long voyages, and the looming gallows that awaited many of them if ever they were captured. But not all havens were so lively. Some were quieter, little-known islands known only to certain captains and crews. These were places of secrecy, where ships could careen, tipped on their sides for repair, while the crew scraped barnacles from the hull, patched leaks, or replaced sails bleached and torn by the sun. Life here was less about revelry and more about survival, gathering coconuts, catching fish, boiling water over driftwood fires. In these hidden corners, pirates lived with a strange mixture of freedom and fragility. They had escaped the strict hierarchies of noble courts and naval fleets, but they lived always on borrowed time. A sudden arrival of a warship could scatter them. A storm could wipe out months of hard-earned plunder. And yet the havens endured, if only for brief stretches. Back in Europe, noble families dined beneath chandeliers, with servants placing silver platters before them. In contrast, a pirate's banquet might be little more than salted pork, hardtack, soft-cod, and rum, or if fortune smiled, a roasted pig on a spit. And yet there was laughter, there was song, there was a sense, however fleeting, that the rules of the wider world did not apply here. When you close your eyes, you might hear the low hum of voices rising from a shoreline tavern, the slap of waves against wooden hulls, the faint rattle of dice in a sailor's palm. These were the havens that sustained them, little breathing spaces in a life of constant motion. They were fragile oases of freedom, carved out of the sea's endless expanse. Flags and fear. The symbolism of the Jolly Roger, out on the open sea, long before ships met cannon to cannon, there was often a moment of silence, a stillness. The wind caught the sails, the waves rolled steadily beneath the hull, and then, high on the mast, a flag was raised. It was not the bright colors of a kingdom, not the noble crest of Spain, England, or France. No, this was something darker, a field of black cloth snapping in the wind, and on it stark white bones, a skull grinning forever, crossbones beneath, or perhaps a skeleton carrying a spear, or an hourglass whose sand was almost spent. This was the Jolly Roger. For sailors on a merchant ship, seeing that black flag appear on the horizon could be enough to freeze the blood in their veins. The flag was not just cloth, it was a promise, a warning. It whispered, surrender quickly, and perhaps you will live. Resist, and you will not. Each pirate captain had his own variation. Some used the familiar skull and crossbones. Others painted hourglasses to remind their victims that time was running out. Some even added red, a bloody flag, signaling that no mercy would be shown. In the Caribbean sun, these symbols fluttered like omens, simple in design but heavy with meaning. Imagine yourself aboard a merchant vessel, carrying barrels of sugar or bales of cloth across calm waters. The day is warm, the sails are full, and then one of your crew points to the horizon. A ship approaches, faster than expected. You see the dark flag go up stark against the blue sky, and suddenly every voice aboard falls quiet. The captain of your ship must decide: fight, flee, or surrender. For pirates, the flag was a tool as much as any cannon or cutlass. Raising it often avoided bloodshed altogether. Many merchant crews, knowing they were outmatched, would yield rather than face certain death. The flag itself did the work, a symbol carrying centuries of fear. And yet the Jolly Roger was not raised at all times. Pirates often approached with false colors, flying the flag of a navy or a friendly nation until they were close enough to strike. Only at the last moment did the black banner snap into view, like a curtain pulled back to reveal the truth. At night, in harbors or hidden coves, the flag was folded away. But during the day, when a victim was in sight, its stark contrast against the sky sent a message louder than cannon fire. This was no ordinary ship. This was a predator. On land, nobles marked their power with coats of arms, carved in stone or embroidered in gold. Pirates, without such luxuries, marked theirs with a piece of cloth, a cloth that carried a reputation fierce enough to terrify an entire sea. So when you close your eyes tonight, picture that black fabric rippling in the wind, bones stark against the sky, and imagine the hush that fell across the decks of countless ships when they saw it, a silence that meant fear, a silence that meant choice. Why you'd regret becoming a pirate in 1565, not with sweat, exactly, but with the slow accumulation of sea mist, leaking tar, and the breath of dozens of men sharing the same low-ceilinged hold. On good days, the wind is strong and you're moving quickly, cutting through waves under pale sails. On bad days, the air is still, the ship drifts aimlessly, and tempers rise with the temperature. The air is heavy thick with mildew, the stench of old fish, and the unmistakable scent of bodies unwashed for weeks at sea. Rain is cold, relentless. Storms howl without mercy. In hot climates, the sun cooks the deck until your soles blister through your boots. At night, the cold seeps in silently and gnaws at your fingers. Imagine this: the darkness around you is almost complete, save for a few strands of faint gray light creeping through the wooden slats of the hull. You're sleeping in a hammock that sways with every movement of the waves rocking gently. Yes, but not always comfortingly. You wake not to the sound of bird song or bells, but to the thud of boots above your head and the sour scent of stale salt water. Your skin is damp. You are aboard a pirate ship in the year 1565. Your day begins not with coffee or conversation, but with labor. The food is no comfort, and you drink often not for pleasure, but to dull the endless ache in your back and the sting of salt in your cracked lips. Privacy does not exist here, and yet this is better than the alternative. The weather is your constant overseer, and then there's the waiting. You may have joined for the promise of treasure. And what of disease? Syphilis is rampant among the crew. You swab the deck. You hold the lines, but still you remain. This is not a tale of glory. This is the rhythm of their lives. And it is a rhythm you've joined, however unwillingly. Step after step, rope after rope, day after day, until the sea takes what it wants. The tragic reign of Blackbeard, now that the scent of damp wood and rotting fruit aboard a pirate vessel still lingers in your imagination, let us drift further into the sea fog, this time to follow the shadowed wake of one of piracy, as most legendary figures. His real name was Edward Teach, or Thatch, depending on the spelling. He would come to be known as Blackbeard, a name whispered in fear, scribbled in Admiralty papers, and spun into wild tales at dockside taverns from Bristol to Barbados. A man who knew how to use fear without always needing force, and as you'll see, His story, though legendary, is not one of endless victories. It's a story of power built quickly and lost just as fast. He likely hailed from Bristol in England, born sometime in the 1680s. That in itself says something. The real Blackbeard was quieter, calculated, strategic, a boy who might have wandered narrow cobbled streets, dodging wagon wheels and inhaling the damp salt breeze that rolled upriver from the docks. But forget the roaring, sword-waving caricature. Humble beginnings in shadowed ports, because it was one of the few professions left to skilled, sea-worn men without titles or wealth. We don't know much about Edward Teach's early life. He likely learned to sail in Queen Anne's War, serving as a privateer, a sort of legal pirate fighting on behalf of England against the Spanish and French. He made violence a rumor, not a necessity. He rarely harmed captives. Most surrendered without a fight, not for bloodlust or treasure alone, but his legend grew not from slaughter, but from performance, and holding prominent citizens hostage until the town supplied him with a chest of medicine. But his brutality was selective, targeted. He had men flogged, marooned, or worse when it suited him. When the war ended in 1713, many men like him found themselves out of work, and too experienced in violence to return easily to civilian life. Ships often gave up their cargo without a single shot. That's how piracy became a career. It's said he once shot one of his own men, not out of anger, but to remind the others that he didn't have to explain himself. Still, the image of Blackbeard quietly playing house along the Carolina coast is difficult to reconcile with the smoke-wreathed specter he once was. One who found brief mastery over the seas, not through madness, but by becoming what others feared most. Edward joined the pirate Benjamin Hornigold, and by 1717 he had his own command. The new colonial governor, Charles Eden, welcomed him with suspicious warmth. His Queen Anne's Revenge had been lost months earlier, run aground near Beaufort. That morning the pirate had likely just finished breakfast. So in November 1718, he sent 2 sloops under Lieutenant Robert Maynard to kill him, without the knowledge or approval of North Carolina's governor. His body was thrown into the sea. Some say it swam 3 laps around the boat before sinking, a final legend born from shock and awe. He cultivated an image designed to terrify before a single cannon fired. For a time, Teach lived a double life, ostensibly retired, but still smuggling goods, still dabbling in piracy through secret channels. The details come mostly from Maynard's own account, and may be exaggerated, but by all accounts it was brutal, not in riches or glory, but in betrayal, blood, and a secret war between colonies, one who understood power and illusion. A French slave ship named La Concorde, captured off the coast of Martinique. Within a few years, stories would claim he had buried treasure across the Caribbean, that his ghost haunted coastal waters, that he had made a pact with the devil. Before battles, he would twist hemp slow matches into his beard and light them, letting smoke curl around his face like a devil rising from the depths. He renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, armed it with 40 guns, and turned it into a floating fortress. The theater of terror, Blackbeard understood psychology. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, dark coat, and bandoliers across his chest, often more for appearance than practicality. But reports from survivors paint a man who was more measured than mad. And it worked. Still, he was no saint. He blockaded the port of Charleston in 1718, capturing several ships. Even among his crew, he inspired both loyalty and fear, retirement, betrayal, and the final battle. In 1718, Blackbeard accepted a royal pardon in North Carolina. He even married a local woman, his supposed 14th wife. Some claim she was barely a teenager, though historical evidence is murky. But peace never lasts for pirates. Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, feared Blackbeard's influence. They found Blackbeard in a Creocoke inlet. He had only a few men. Maynard's men closed in. A vicious hand-to-hand battle erupted aboard Blackbeard's smaller vessel. Teach reportedly sustained over 20 wounds, 5 of them gunshots. Still, he kept fighting, swinging his cutlass, until at last he fell. His head was severed and hung from the bow of Maynard's ship. What power leaves behind? And so ended Blackbeard. His legend, however, only grew. But if you strip away the fog and the flames, what remains is a man. Tonight, you've drifted with him through calm coves and cannon smoke, watching the rise and fall of a man more complex than legend allows. Now, as the waters settle once more, we gently turn from the man and toward the myths he left behind. Let's linger a while longer in the waters of myth. Even if pirates rarely buried their plunder, the sea itself became a kind of vault, reluctant, ever-moving, and layered in silt. Ships went down in storms, during skirmishes, or from simple misfortune. And when they sank, whatever they carried often stayed with them. Coins, weapons, cargo bones. Time made no effort to retrieve them. But sometimes the distinction blurs. Over centuries, these wrecks hardened into legend. Locals would point to strange currents or whispers of light beneath the waves. Some said they saw golden glimmers just before dusk, or heard the creaking of a phantom ship in the fog. Others uncover fragments of chainmail or ornate dagger hilts. There are whispers, too, of Jesuit rings and silver reliquaries locked in the grip of the sea. The possibility that somewhere, perhaps just beyond the reef, something waits to be found. A box, a chest, a carved tablet with markings no one understands. These aren't pirate treasures. They're remnants of empire, religion, and colonial ambition. These coins, known as pieces of 8, were real currency in the age of sail, widely accepted and heavily sought after. No dotted trails to isolated islands. No X-mark survival. We've come to a different kind of vessel, but sealed chests marked with royal insignia coins minted in the Americas. Silver bars wrapped in cloth. Her hull carries not stolen bread or broken dreams. Bolts of dyed silk bound for the court in Madrid. Her timbers groan with the weight of empire. Imagine now the wide, slow-moving dignity of a Spanish treasure galleon. The room is modest by land standards, but almost opulent at sea. Polished wood panels gleam with beeswax. The air was close. Even the best cabins swayed and creaked and grew damp with mildew. But status aboard ship was everything. Each stop Havana, Veracruz, Portobello was carefully recorded, and the distinctions between the common sailor and the titled passenger were clear. A table is bolted to the floor. Nobles and high clergy traveled with trunks full of fine garments, wool cloaks with embroidered hems, or a reef that had shifted with the tide, could send even the grandest galleon to the bottom. Those aboard the treasure fleet measured time in letters and ledgers in celestial charts. Each shipment weighed, sealed, documented. Lace collars stiff with starch. a wrong calculation of latitude vulnerable to the same sea that carried the hopes of poor and rich alike. Slippers made from soft leather dyed in costly hues, not entirely of land, and always haunted slightly by the vastness of what lay beneath the surface. These outfits served no real purpose. Its sea salt air dulled their brilliance, bells rang, streets filled. Officials declared the safe return of the king's treasure. What lingered was often something quieter, a sense of having been suspended between worlds, carrying trays, polishing boots, or fanning the air with palm fronds. But for those who made the crossing, quickly, but they were worn all the same, a performance of status, a reminder that their journey was not merely across water, not just for sailing watches, but for prayer, but across the scaffolding of empire. And maps are neatly rolled in oiled leather tubes, or enslaved Africans forced to labor in silence. These figures, often invisible in the official records, moved through the ship with bowed heads. It was a sound of civility, of the old world clinging to its customs, even in the middle of the ocean. Their hands absorbed the motion of the ship, the sting of reprimands, and the weight of an order that saw them only as part of the furnishings of wealth. A silver crucifix rests above the bunk, and a tiny bottle of lavender oil keepsakes from home. Every day, bells marked the hours, fingers worked the beads while lips whispered Ave Marias, leather-bound volumes shared among the learned and the curious, sermons, histories, poems. Some passengers brought instruments, lutes or small harps, and their sounds, however fragile, drifted over the darkening waves in the evenings. The notes were often out of tune from the humidity, but no one much minded, which left the new world in predictable intervals, seeking protection from tempests and the threat of pirates, or simply from the quiet terror of vanishing into the sea with no trace. But their decks also hosted a quieter cargo, people. No monument, no last rites. A priest aboard would lead morning mass in a makeshift chapel below the poop deck, his voice rising gently over the groan of the timbers and the occasional splash of seawater against the hull. Next to a cedar box filled with prayer beads, a silk handkerchief. These ships were built not for speed, but for certainty. Stewards brought food on pewter or even silver plates, slow-cooked stews, preserved fruits soaked in honey, game birds salted and packed in ceramic pots. There might be wine from Andalusia, watered down and slightly brackish, but still aromatic. Hurricanes could split a fleet in two. Disease moved silently through crowded cabins. Or figs from Seville, wrapped carefully in waxed linen. Broad-beamed and deeply laden, they formed part of a convoy system known as the flota. Their mission was to ferry riches, literal, political, and symbolic, from colonial territories back to the crown. Nobles, clergy, merchants, officials, all traveling under protection of the fleet's guns and God's perceived favor. Let's walk gently through one of these ships. Not in the brig or below the waterline where mold crept into timbers, but in the upper cabins reserved for those whose names carried weight. In the captain's quarters, sunlight filters through small glass panes, imported at great cost and often fogged with salt. Meals for the elite aboard a treasure galleon were worlds apart from the biscuit and brine of the lower decks. Of course, conditions still weren't luxurious by today's standards. Clothing, too, separated the ranks. Some passengers brought servants, young boys from noble families sent to learn obedience. Religion, too, filled the air like incense. The rosary was common, especially during storms. For entertainment, there were books, and while the pirates measured their success by plunder and survival, still danger was never far. And so, despite all its ceremony and polish, the Spanish treasure fleet remained a fragile organism. Its splendor rode on salt and wind. When the ships made it home to Seville or Cadiz, there was rejoicing. Not entirely at sea. The rhythms of the sea, pirate superstitions, rituals, and quiet moments, a calm descent into the quieter, more ambient side of pirate life, rituals whispered in the dark, tokens nailed to masts, and the superstitions that helped men survive the endless roll of the sea. So far, we've followed the hard-tacked footsteps of pirates through hardship, hunger, gold, and gunpowder. But as dusk falls over the ocean and the ship settles into its slow, creaking rhythm, there is still more to drift into. And watching, it was filled with whispers, rituals, and little moments of quiet, where men tried to shape fate with fragments of belief. Because pirate life was not just violence and salt, it was long stretches of waiting. Let's take one more journey across the deck. Slower now, softer. Others refused to sail if the rancid started jumping ship. If a broom fell over in the galley, a delay. This was the threshold. It felt like the ship itself was holding its breath. If a sailor sneezed more than 3 times in a row, the final rope still coiled, the anchor still planted. The voyage might be postponed altogether. Not a prayer, exactly, but a sort of bargain. Don't take me this time. Some offered drops of rum or a pinch of salt. Let the mast hold. Toward whatever waited in the dark beyond the bay, let the storm pass through me. This was considered deeply dangerous. A renamed ship had to be unnamed first. Some kissed the wood. Her painted eyes stared outward across the water, to the creaking of the ropes, to the whispers between gulls, toward the habits and hopes of men adrift between worlds. Rituals before setting sail. If a ship had changed hands or been captured and renamed, her old title formally erased from every board, every ledger, every tool. Only then, with ceremony sometimes involving fire and wine, could the new name be offered to the sea. With the belief, fragile but fierce, that maybe, just maybe, the sea could be reasoned with. Some were rowdy, even strange. On certain ships, a dummy sailor, made of rope, listened to the wind in the sails. An ill-timed gust or an echo that sounded like a cry could unravel confidence built over months of planning. And rags would be thrown into the sea before departure, to fool the sea into thinking it had claimed someone. Others held mock funerals for land life, complete with a small coffin made of driftwood and wine bottles. Laughter could be just another kind of protection. This was not just engineering, it was negotiation with the unknown. The sea was not trusted, she was courted. Familiar sounds faded. The ship slipped into another world. Before the anchor was lifted or the sails were unfurled, the ship itself had to be persuaded to go. The deck still slick from the night's condensation. Conversations were hushed, boots carefully placed. Some men tied bits of red cloth around the rigging. Others scratched tiny crosses into the mast where no one would see them. A few carried coins or beads in their pockets, never to be spent, just touched when the horizon turned black. Eyes glancing upward to check for signs, cloud patterns, gull behavior, the quality of the wind. Everything could be a message. Everything might mean something. No voyage began in certainty. Sailors gathered slowly in the early light. Some captains believed it was bad luck to leave port on a Friday. Even before loading supplies, there was the matter of marking the ship. Chalk symbols were drawn quietly on bulkheads. There was often a moment just before departure where the crew fell silent. At the bow, a sailor might kneel and press his palm to the hull, whispering something low and private. The figurehead, always watching, was touched for luck. Not all rituals were solemn. Then there was the naming, and always, before setting out, the crew listened. Once the final signal was given, it was not celebration that followed, but a kind of quiet dread. The land grew smaller, and the sea larger. And so they went forward armed not only with gunpowder and charts, but with rituals, with carved wood and whispered bargains. When night fell at sea, it didn't fall like it did on land. There were no lamplighters, no fireflies, no comforting glow through windows. There was just the slow dimming of the sky, the sinking of color into ink, and the endless hush of waves. Darkness aboard a ship wasn't just a time of day, it was a world of its own. Those on duty walked the deck slowly, lanterns carefully shielded, eyes scanning the endless dark. Sometimes there was moonlight, glittering on the water like scattered silver. Whistling was forbidden, so it was thought to summon the wind, and not always the friendly kind. Dropping a rope into the sea at night was taboo too. Some believed the deep would take it as an invitation. Others swore that if you stared too long into the black water, it would stare back. A sailor would sit at the bow and speak aloud, not to anyone, but to the sea or to memories. A lost brother, a girl left behind in Havana, a question never answered. The sea was patient, broken by nothing but the sound of the ship's own groaning timbers. It listened. Other times there was only the wet black of the void, or food with flavor, or the weight of gold. But the men above did not dream. They listened. They watched. They whispered their fears into the wind and watched them disappear. The ship didn't sleep. A secret, a test. And those who kept watch became part of it, wrapped in salt air, darkness, and the slow turning of the earth beneath the ship. The helmsman, hands fixed on the wheel, might whisper a prayer with each passing hour. In some places the sea glowed faintly phosphorescent plankton lighting up in the ship's wake. On such nights it felt as if the ship were drifting through stars instead of waves. If a storm rolled in, the watch called below, and boots thudded on wet planks as the crew readied themselves. But often the hours passed without event, leaving only the sensation of waiting. Waiting for dawn, waiting for change, waiting for land or battle or just the next moment to arrive. It couldn't. A vessel adrift on the ocean, even in calm weather, was always in motion, always vulnerable. No shouting, no gambling, no hammering or singing. Just the pulse of water against wood, the sigh of canvas, the slow ticking of time. And so the crew slept in shifts, divided into watches. Some would rest, others would guard. 4 hours here, 4 hours there. A rhythm not tied to sunrise or meal times, but to duty and the demands of the sea. The night watch was a realm of low voices, soft footfalls, and woolen cloaks pulled tight against the chill. The lookout might hum to himself, more for comfort than company. There were superstitions unique to the dark. Still, there was a strange peace to those hours. The usual noise of the crew was gone. If rain came, it was accepted quietly. Sometimes, during the stillest parts of the night, below deck, hammocks swayed, creaked softly. Men dreamed of dry land. Night at sea was a long hush. The sound of the ship, a floating symphony of wood and wind. If you had ever fallen asleep aboard a pirate ship, not from peace, but from exhaustion, you wouldn't have done so in silence. There is no silence at sea. Instead, there is a kind of constant living murmur, stitched together from hundreds of small, repeating sounds. A lullaby not written by any composer, but by time, motion, and the sea itself. The ship spoke in groans. Its planks, swollen with salt and moisture, expanded and contracted with every rise and fall of the hull. Each wave nudged the timbers to shift and sigh. The sound was deep, wood against wood, tired and old, like a man stretching sore limbs. When the wind caught them just right, they snapped out in a full breath, crisp and confident. Not just the crashing of waves, though that happened often, but smaller things. A soft slap of water against the hull, a hiss with the bow cut forward. It smelled of salt, of fish, of storms far away, and it seemed to speak, though not in words. It carried the thoughts of the crew across the water, scattering them like seeds that would never grow. A bubbling gurgle when the ship rocked to one side and the ocean kissed the lower planks. But most of the time, they fluttered like fabric being tested by ghosts. That sound, especially at night, was like the wings of some distant bird that would never land. Long after you'd found land and floorboards and stillness again, part of you would still hear it, the song of the ship, the sound of motion without destination, a lullaby written by water and wood. The ropes, dozens, hundreds hummed, slapped, and strained, an old wheezing organ that played itself. Every creak, every flap, every sigh of hemp and cloth and timber joined into a slow oceanic hymn. They held the sails taut and the masts upright, and they rarely stopped moving. Some tightened and creaked like violin strings in slow motion. Others thumped gently against the deck, with each sway of the vessel, a soft, patient rhythm, like a child knocking politely at a door. The sails themselves joined the chorus, snored through their noses, murmured names in their sleep. It was never quiet, but it was never loud. Then there were the footsteps, sometimes in unison, sometimes staggered like waves, but made of cloth and bone. Men breathed through their mouths, even barefoot. A pirate made noise. The boards flexed underfoot, especially on the upper deck. You might hear a soft clomp of boots or the brush of a heel against the grain. It was never frantic, just the slow patrol of the watch, or a man relieving himself over the side, or someone moving toward the galley in search of another stale biscuit. Below, in the sleeping quarters, hammocks swayed and groaned as they rubbed against their hooks. A low creak, back and forth, back and forth. The sea itself had its own voice, and in between all these things was the wind, sometimes howling, yes, but more often it whispered through the rigging, through the sails, along the open deck. When the ship was calm and the men were asleep, and only the night watch stirred, the vessel became a kind of instrument. You didn't sleep in silence. You slept in rhythm, and even long after you'd left the sea. And now you're drifting, not on the open sea, not lashed to a mast or curled in a damp hammock, but here in stillness. Your breath is slower now, your mind quieter. The groan of the ship has faded. You've glimpsed the rise and unraveling of Blackbeard, once feared across oceans, now resting beneath them. You've followed the tangled threads of myth and legend, the truth behind treasures never truly buried, and felt the stark contrast between ships of plunder and those of polished silver and whispered prayer, no calloused hands pulling ropes, no cannon fire in the distance, just the quiet rise and fall of your breath. Like the tide, the flap of the sails now distant, like a memory receding across water. A bed, a room that does not sway, air that does not sting with salt, no storm ahead, no watch to stand. Just the soft hush of time moving past you like a gentle current, even as they lived upon it. You've wandered through the daily struggles of the common pirate, the heat, the hunger, the soaked hammocks and spoiled rations. You've listened to the sounds of superstition, the echoes of rituals, the quiet murmurs of men who feared the sea, and now you're free to let it all go. There are no sails above you here. The lives we've glimpsed tonight, so distant, so harsh, so restless, have given way to the comfort of your present. Let yourself drift. Let the sea recede. Let the creaking ship grow small and silent on the horizon of your thoughts. You are not in 1565. You are not a pirate. You are here. You are safe. You are still. And sleep, like the tide, has come in. Good night.